In the vast remote forests of northern Canada, nature reigns supreme. The wilderness stretches endlessly, with no cell service, no marked roads, and only the sound of the wind moving through the trees to keep you company. It's a place where isolation isn't just a feeling, it's a reality. For three hikers, what was meant to be a weekend escape from the noise of city life turned into a nightmare they would never forget. This is a story of survival and terror that will make you think twice before venturing too far from civilization. Jake, Chris, and Emma had been planning their trip for weeks. Jake was the leader of the group, confident, experienced, and always up for a challenge. Chris, the skeptic, loved to crack jokes about anything that seemed out of the ordinary. Emma was more cautious, but her love for photography had drawn her to the promise of capturing the untouched beauty of the northern wilderness. The plan was simple: a 3-day hike through a lesser-known trail that wound its way deep into the heart of the forest. They arrived early on a crisp Friday morning, their backpacks loaded with supplies. The air was fresh, the sky clear, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The first day went smoothly. They laughed, shared stories, and marveled at the sheer beauty of their surroundings. As night fell, they set up camp near a small clearing. The fire crackled, casting warm light against the dark woods. The silence of the forest was almost comforting, until it wasn't. It started with the sound of twigs snapping just beyond the glow of their fire. Jake assured them it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Chris, always the joker, whispered, "Maybe it's Bigfoot," earning an eye roll from Emma. The noises continued throughout the night. Soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the distinct feeling of being observed. When they woke the next morning, they found strange marks carved into a nearby tree, long, deliberate scratches that formed an unsettling pattern. Jake dismissed it as the work of animals, but Emma took a picture, her unease growing. Day 2 brought more signs that something wasn't right. As they hiked deeper into the forest, they discovered totems made of sticks and bones, arranged in patterns that felt intentional. Emma's anxiety was palpable, but Chris laughed it off. "People do weird things in the woods," he said with a shrug. That night, the real terror began. The fire burned low as they sat in silence, the weight of the forest pressing in around them. Then came the sound. A whisper so faint it could have been the wind, except it carried words they couldn't understand. Emma clutched her camera, her eyes scanning the darkness. Chris stood up, peering into the trees. "Hello?" he called, his voice steady but wary. 2 glowing eyes appeared just beyond the edge of the firelight. "Do you see that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, reaching for a stick to stoke the fire. The eyes vanished as the flames roared to life. They stayed awake the rest of the night, huddled close together, listening to the sounds of the forest. Morning brought no relief. Their campsite was in shambles, tents slashed, supplies scattered. But the most chilling discovery was a message scratched into the dirt: "We see you." Panic set in. They packed their gear in silence and began their journey back. The trail that had seemed so clear now felt unfamiliar. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent their hearts racing. It was as if the forest itself had come alive. As the day wore on, the sense of dread grew heavier. They found more footprints, larger than any humans, and always just far enough ahead to be out of sight. Emma's breathing grew shallow, her eyes darting at every movement. Jake kept them moving, his determination to reach safety unwavering. Then came the whistle. It was soft at first, a single haunting note that hung in the air. It grew louder, closer. Chris turned toward the sound, his face pale. "We have to run," he whispered. They bolted, their footsteps pounding the forest floor. The whistle followed, joined by the sound of branches breaking, as if something massive was moving through the trees. Emma glanced back and saw it. A shadowy figure, tall and impossibly thin, moving with unnatural grace. It didn't walk, it glided between the trees, its limbs bending at grotesque angles. the glowing eyes locked onto hers. Chris was the first to disappear. One moment he was beside her, the next, his scream was swallowed by the forest. Jake grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her forward as terror threatened to consume them both. They ran until their lungs burned, until the world blurred into darkness. When Emma finally emerged from the forest, the sun was rising. Her clothes were torn, her body bruised and bleeding. She collapsed at the edge of a dirt road, her mind a whirl of fear and disbelief. Search teams combed the forest for days. They found no trace of Jake or Chris. No footprints, no totems, no eyes. The case remains unsolved. Locals speak in hushed tones of the Watcher of the Woods, a presence that stalks those who dare to wander too far from the safety of the trails. Some say it's a spirit, others believe it's something far worse, a being that thrives on fear, a predator that waits in the shadows. Whatever it is, one thing is certain: the forest is a place of beauty and danger, a realm where silence can hide unimaginable horrors. So the next time you hear footsteps behind you in the woods, when you feel the hairs on the back of your neck rise for no reason at all, remember this story and ask yourself one question: are you really alone? The Appalachian forests have always been a place of haunting beauty. Thick canopies of trees, endless trails, and silence so deep it feels alive. But not all trails lead back to safety. Some vanish. And some stories, shared in whispers around campfires, speak of things that should be left undisturbed. This is one of those stories. Brandon, Jenna, Tyler, and Mia had been friends since college. Camping was their tradition, a way to escape the grind of work and reconnect with nature. Brandon, ever the thrill seeker, had found a lesser-known trail deep in the Appalachian wilderness. It was perfect. Isolated, challenging, and rumored to lead to an abandoned campsite no one had used in decades. They arrived on a chilly October afternoon, the leaves a fiery red and gold. The air smelled of earth and pine, and a light fog clung to the ground. Brandon led the way, his map in hand, as Jenna followed close behind, rolling her eyes at his enthusiasm. Tyler, ever cautious, trailed with Mia, who was already regretting the trip. After hours of hiking, they found it, a clearing that seemed untouched by time. The remnants of old wooden structures lay rotting, and a fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by stones blackened with ash. But it was the totems that made them stop. Twisted bundles of sticks and bones hung from the trees, their shapes eerily human. Jenna shivered. "This place gives me the creeps." "Exactly why it's perfect," Brandon grinned. "Come on, it's just some old art project or something." Mia stared at a symbol carved into a tree, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward. "This isn't art. We shouldn't be here." "Relax," Brandon said, setting up his tent. "It's just a story." The fire crackled as night settled in. Shadows danced against the trees and the cold crept closer. The forest, silent during the day, seemed to whisper now. It began subtly, a snap of a twig, a rustling just beyond the fire's glow. Mia clutched her jacket, her eyes darting into the dark. "Probably just a deer," Brandon said. Tyler poked at the fire, watching the sparks rise. "Doesn't feel like a deer." Suddenly, a soft thump landed near his feet. He jumped, staring down at a small, carved wooden figure, its face twisted in agony. "And who threw that?" he snapped. Jenna shook her head. "I didn't see anything." Brandon laughed nervously. "Come on, it's probably been here for years. You're just imagining things." But as the fire burned lower, the feeling grew. The forest wasn't empty. Something was watching. When they woke the next morning, Brandon was gone. His tent lay empty, the zipper torn as if yanked apart. Drag marks led away from the campsite, disappearing into the trees. "Brandon!" Jenna's voice cracked as she called out. Only silence answered. Tyler gripped his backpack, his knuckles white. "We need to leave. Now." "We can't just leave him," Mia cried. Jenna's eyes scanned the forest. "We'll find him. He couldn't have gone far." They followed the drag marks, calling his name. The forest grew darker, the trees closer. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of wrongness. And then they heard it. A faint chanting, rhythmic and low, coming from deep within the woods. Mia stopped, her heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" Tyler nodded, his breath shallow. "We shouldn't be here." The chanting grew louder, mixed with the sound of branches snapping and something moving just out of sight. They stumbled into a clearing and their breath caught in their throats. A crude altar stood in the center, made of twisted roots and bones. Dark stains marked its surface. Surrounding it were more totems, each one more grotesque than the last. Jenna backed away, her eyes wide. "We have to go." But Tyler had already found something else. An ancient book, its cover cracked and bound in leather. He opened it, the pages filled with strange symbols and drawings of shadowed figures. "It's a ritual book," he whispered, his voice trembling. Mia turned to him, fear etched on her face. "Put it down." The forest erupted in whispers, the voices growing louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language none of them understood, but they knew it was calling their names. Tyler dropped the book, his hands shaking. "We have to run." They fled, their footsteps pounding the forest floor. The trees seemed to close in, the path twisting and turning. Every step echoed with the sound of something pursuing them, just out of sight. Mia looked back and saw it. A shadowy figure, tall and gaunt with limbs that moved unnaturally. Its eyes glowed with a sickly light and it moved with a grace that defied nature. "Faster!" she screamed. Branches whipped at their faces as they ran, the chanting and whispers a cacophony around them. Tyler stumbled, his scream swallowed by the dark. "Tyler?" Jenna turned, but he was gone. When they burst out of the forest onto the road, the first rays of dawn broke through the fog. Jenna and Mia collapsed, gasping for breath. They looked back, but the forest was silent, still. There was no sign of Brandon or Tyler. Search teams combed the area for days. They found no trace of the abandoned campsite, no totems, no altar, just an empty stretch of woods. Locals spoke of the vanishing campground, a place that appears only to claim the lost. Some say it's the work of ancient rituals, a forest that feeds on souls. The mystery remains unsolved. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from the safety of civilization, and you come across a campsite that doesn't feel quite right, trust your instincts, because some places were never meant to be found. The wilderness hides secrets, stories that get passed around campfires but often dismissed as myths. But sometimes those stories come from real encounters, encounters that leave behind unanswered questions and people too terrified to speak. This story is one of them. Daniel had been a park ranger for 15 years, patrolling a vast, untamed national forest stretching for miles. He loved the isolation and the tranquility that came with the job. But after his final assignment, he would never set foot in those woods again. It started with the patterns. During one of his nightly patrols, Daniel noticed something strange. Trees with symbols carved into the bark, spirals, jagged eyes, and human-like figures. At first, he thought it was vandalism from bored hikers, but they appeared in places no regular person would venture. Then came the campfires. He began finding freshly extinguished fire pits far from any designated trails. Around one, he saw small wooden effigies, crude human shapes with twisted limbs, standing like sentinels. Empty cans stood in decoration. Unease prickled his skin. He reported his findings, but his superiors dismissed them. Kids messing around, they told him. But Daniel knew the wilderness better than anyone, and this was no prank. One night, while patrolling a remote section of the park, he heard something unusual. Footsteps behind him. He stopped. Listen. He turned, shining his flashlight. Trees stood motionless. The beam of light stretched far into the dark, but there was nothing there. He shrugged it off. chalking it up to his imagination. But the feeling didn't leave him. It felt as if something had been there, just outside his vision, waiting. Over the next few nights, the patterns intensified. He found more symbols, freshly carved and arranged with precision that felt deliberate. One tree had a spiral so deep it seemed to twist into the heartwood. Another bore a crude figure with hollow circles for eyes. He began taking his dog Shadow on patrols for company. Shadow, a loyal black shepherd, was fearless, but one night, as they walked near an old, overgrown path, Shadow stopped abruptly. The dog's ears pinned back, his body tense. A low growl rumbled from his throat as he stared into the darkness. "Oh, what is it, boy?" Daniel whispered, aiming his flashlight. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating branches and leaves, but beyond that, shadows danced, just out of reach. Shadow barked furiously, lunging forward. Then Daniel saw it. A tall, thin figure, unnaturally elongated, its limbs too long and joints bent at wrong angles. It stood just outside the light, eyes glowing with a dull, amber light. In a blink, it was gone. Daniel returned to his cabin that night, heart racing. He locked the door, drew the blinds, and kept the fire burning. Sleep didn't come easy. His dreams were filled with whispering voices and fire-lit eyes watching from the trees. When he woke, his cabin door was wide open. Daniel's instincts told him to stay out of the woods, but he was a ranger. It was his job to protect the park. One final patrol, that's all it would take. The night was colder than usual. His lantern flickered as he approached a familiar trail. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. He followed faint footprints leading deeper into the trees. The trail ended at a clearing he hadn't seen before. In its center was a circle of stones surrounding a blackened fire pit. Bones, small and large, were scattered within. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He heard the whispers again, low, rhythmic, coming from nowhere and everywhere. He spun around, lantern raised. The shadows stretched toward him, dark tendrils clawing the earth. Then he saw it again. A figure, and stepped into view, impossibly tall, its skeletal frame draped in shadows. Its eyes burned with a sickly amber glow. It moved closer, its gait unnatural, as if gliding rather than walking. Daniel stumbled backward, his lantern slipping from his grasp. The light dimmed, flickering before extinguishing altogether. Darkness swallowed him whole. When he awoke, he was lying at the edge of the forest. His uniform was torn, his skin cold and clammy. Shadow was gone. He never found his dog. Daniel resigned the next day. He moved far from the forest and never spoke of what happened. But the reports didn't stop. More disappearances, more symbols, more shadows. The official records list the area as a hazardous wilderness zone. Locals call it the place where the fire watches. The strange encounters continued. Weeks after Daniel's departure, another ranger reported eerie sounds echoing through the trees, a low, mournful hum that seemed to follow him. He described it as if the forest itself were breathing. In a rare confession, a veteran ranger recalled seeing a row of lanterns swaying deep in the woods, moving as if carried by unseen hands. He had followed them once, but the light always stayed just beyond reach. When he turned back, his own lantern had gone out. Another chilling account involved a missing hiker. The search team found his backpack and gear neatly arranged at the base of a tree marked with one of the strange spirals. His notebook, left open, contained a single, scrawled sentence. "The fire has eyes." They never found his body. So if you're ever deep in the woods, far from the safety of civilization, and you feel a shadow flicker at the edge of your fire, be careful. It might not be your imagination, and it's never truly alone.